Hello, this is NEMYRIALIVE, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And we are very happy that our guest today is Paul Goble. He is an American political scientist, journalist, and expert on ethno-politics in the former USSR. And he studied national issues in Russia and the post-Soviet space over the 14 years. And he worked in the US State Department and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and he is one of the few American analysts who predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mr. Goble, hello, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Goble, we remember how before the collapse of the USSR, many on the West were afraid that the collapse of the Soviet Union will change the situation dramatically. And I remember the visit of President Bush to Kiev when he gave his, everybody remember his speech in Ukrainian parliament. Yeah. And now there is a strong feeling that the history repeat right now. And that the West is more afraid the collapse of Russia than it wants Ukraine to win. What do you think about that?
Well, I think what the problem you're pointing to is very real. The reason that it's real is because people are asking the question in the wrong way. If the Soviet Union had continued to exist, it would have been a threat to its own people and to everyone else far greater than the threat that the disintegrated place meant. The same thing is true now. A Russian Federation that stays in one piece is going to be a far greater threat to peace and stability in the world than a Russian Federation that comes apart. If you ask the question that way, you can see clearly that it is in the interests of the world and of the peoples now within the borders of the Russian Federation, for the Russian Federation to disintegrate. But unfortunately, the way the question was posed in 1990 and 1991, and the way it's being posed now, takes up only half of the equation. It doesn't say what will be the case if Russia doesn't fall apart. The fact is, had the national self-determination wave that swept across what was the USSR continued as it should have, to include Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, the peoples of the North Caucasus, we wouldn't now be faced with a situation where Moscow is bombing Ukraine on a daily basis, a murderous campaign that I fear will grow worse in the next 7 weeks, and we wouldn't be facing the tensions between Moscow and the West. The problem is that the Russian leadership believes that Russia is and should be an empire, and that means it should extend. It is in the interests of the peoples of that region, and indeed the peoples of the entire world, that the Russian Empire cease to exist. That won't be easy. It won't be without conflict and even violence, but it will be with less violence and less conflict than if the Russian Federation remains in place. So it's how you ask the question. And the way people are asking it in the West now, just as the way they ask it in 1990, is the wrong way. The question is not, are we going to have problems if the place comes apart? Absolutely. Are those problems going to be greater or less than the problems we have with the Russian Federation in one piece? I think the answer is beyond question obvious. We're going to have more problems if the Russian Federation remains in one piece than if the Russian Federation disintegrates as it should. All other major empires have fallen apart. This empire should be next.
Do I understand right that the main problem for West and for Western leaders is who will take care about the nuclear weapons if Russia will disintegrate it? I think it's the main question. It was main question for the USSR, and I think it's the same.
Do remember that it was the fear of loose nukes that was behind George Herbert Walker Bush's unfortunate speech in Kiev on August 1st, 1991. But look at the responsible behavior at that time of the governments of Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. I don't think that there's any question that there would be more responsible behavior in the future if the place came apart. The question is, can the Kremlin ever use nuclear weapons on its own people? And the answer is probably not. Um, it might use them on someone else, but uh, introducing the nuclear vocabulary, if you will, simply blocks any full understanding of what was going on. The Soviet Union properly disintegrated into 12 countries plus the three occupied Baltic states. It did so despite all the fears that people were going to go nuclear. Now, having said that, the failure of the West and the United States in particular to live up to its promises to Ukraine in the early 90s makes the problem that we're going to face in the future greater rather than less. Because a lot of people are going to say, if they achieve independence, why should we believe the Americans? Why should we believe the West that giving up nukes to Moscow is a good idea? Had the United States lived up to its commitments in the Budapest Memorandum, had we followed through with what we said, then I don't think we'd have as many problems going forward. Do I think that there's a likelihood of a nuclear exchange on the territory of the Russian Federation? No, I really don't. Nuclear weapons get you a seat at the table. That it gets you the status of a great power. And it may very well, in today's world, be the equivalent of never having to, if you have them, you never have to say you're sorry for anything you do. That may be true. Having said that, they're not weapons that people actually use. The horror of use and the consequences of using any country that uses a nuclear weapon against anybody else is going to be ostracized in ways that no one at this point could dream of. It would make the isolation of North Korea look like a welcome wagon. And my sense is that first we should ask ourselves, what kind of a world do we want? Presumably, we want a world where countries live at peace with one another. Presumably, we want a world where those countries have democratic governments with as much freedom as is possible. Presumably, we want stability, but not stability at the cost of human rights or human suffering. I think that if you ask the question that way, then you have to be again in favor of the disintegration of the Muscovite state, which was an empire in 1991 and which is still an empire. And because it is still an empire, its leaders think they have the right to invade neighboring countries, to kill people in massive numbers, and that the international community should put up with that. I don't think we should. I've favored including Ukraine in NATO for more than 15 years. I think it was a terrible mistake that our response to the Anschluss of Crimea was so weak. I think that it is a terrible mistake that right now we're saying, we're not going to do anything terrible to you right now. But in 50 days, if you haven't changed, we're going to then do something. Let me tell you what that does. It sends a signal to Putin that in the next 7 weeks, he can do pretty much anything he wants to Ukraine, and the West will sit and do nothing. That's the wrong message. People are dying in the streets of Kiev and in other major Ukrainian cities and in villages too. They're dying on the front lines. That does have to stop. But the way you stop a war that you didn't launch but was launched by an aggressor is to defeat the aggressor and drive him out. It's not the way this is being discussed is a tragedy, and we in the West will pay for this in big time ways, just as we are paying now for our failure to live up to the commitments we made in the 1990s, including the Budapest Memorandum. We're if you don't support what you say you're going to support, people are not going to believe you. And the loss of credibility that the West and the United States in particular has suffered because of Ukraine makes the world a far more unstable and dangerous place than the independence of any part of the Russian Federation would. That needs to be remembered, and we need to start changing it. We need to say what we mean. We need to live up to our words, and we need to make sure that Russia loses its invasion of Ukraine, not that it is somehow bought off. I fear that that's going to take a while. I fear many more Ukrainians are going to suffer because of it. But I do believe it's possible. And have to say that many more people in the West are amazed and pleased by what Ukrainians are doing on a daily basis, standing up to the brutal aggression. I live in a small town in Virginia on the east coast of the United States. There are a lot of American flags up all the time. Let me tell you that in this town of 22,000 people, you can't drive a block without seeing a Ukrainian flag too, because the people in this little town are on your side. That's a great thing. And I think it ought to change how we ask questions about the future. Uh, the Russian Federation needs to be driven back to the borders of 1991. It needs to be forced to admit that it has lost its invasion, and it needs to not only allow those peoples within its current borders to become independent if they want to, but to change the fundamental understanding of what it means to be a Russian and what the Russian state is. We need to move to a time when any government that remains in Moscow will be both democratic and not imperial. That's going to require a huge set of changes. It won't happen under Vladimir Putin, the FSB officer who is committed to imperialism and repression. I hope it will happen in the future. It's not going to be easy, but it wasn't easy for Ukrainians who were occupied by Russia in the 17th century and escaped Russian occupation in the 20th and are now fighting to defend what they achieved. It wasn't easy and it won't be easy, but I hope that my country will return to its position of support. We never supported enough. I believe that the Putin's aggression against an occupation of Crimea could have been reversed quickly had the United States made it clear that we want Ukraine in NATO in 2014. Bombs would not be falling on Kiev today. I am absolutely confident of that. We didn't, and the bombs are coming and killing people. And we need to learn from our mistakes and not repeat them.
Mr. Goble, do you think that the disintegration of Russia is possible right now, and what could be the reason for this disintegration? It's
Well, I think
religion or the end of the war or something else?
well, I think the is it possible? Of course it is, but it's best not to ask the question so globally. Is it all going to happen at once? Well, the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, but it only fell part of the way apart. And the process of, I think we're still in the midst of imperial decay. I believe that the Russian Empire has been in decay since 1901, when it occupied northern Afghanistan. I think that since that time, it's been in retreat, first in 1917 with Poland, the Baltic countries, and so on, then in 1991 with so much more. But this is a long-term process. I believe that it will happen. I don't believe it will happen under Putin. That is to say, I don't see Putin saying, yes, I've changed my mind. I'm going to let anyone who wants to leave go. That to me is unthinkable. But there are many Russians who supported the end of the Soviet Union because they believed that the non-Russian republics were a greater burden on them than a benefit. There were many who thought, we're sending money to Central Asia, to South, the Caucasus. Why should we do that? We should be spending that money on ourselves. There are many Russians today who say, why should we be sending money to bomb Ukraine when we don't have enough schools, we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough medicines? That's not important. That's very important. I believe that there will come a time, whether it will be in the next year or the next decade, I can't say, when we will be looking beyond Putin. We'll be looking to Russians who don't want to pay the imperial burden anymore, who realize that it may seem nice to be able to talk about how big a country we are, but if you don't have highways that will allow you to go to the only remaining hospital when you're sick, if your children can't go to schools with indoor plumbing, if you can't have basic freedoms the way Ukrainians do, then what are we trying to hold this together? I think the process will take a while, but it won't be one big bang. I think one of the troubles we have today is that when people talk about the future of the Russian Federation, they mostly look back to 1991. I've written quite a bit about the fact that it's much more appropriate to look back to 1917, that the process there was much slower, both in seeing people leave and see people returned. I believe the same thing will be true. And I think that the lesson we should have learned after 1917 and 1991 is that allowing a Russian core of the country to play on patriotism covers up the evilness that both the Soviet and the Putin regime represent. The fact is, an awful lot of Russians have been sold the idea that the only way to be patriotic is to go and kill Ukrainians. Just as Lenin said, the only way to do it is to defeat the White Guards because they're all supported by the foreign capitalists. Well, it's been observed by many people, not just me, that the tragedy after 1917 is that the West supported the white movement just enough to get it defeated. Had it provided more support, the whites would have won. They would have won. Lenin would be known only to a few experts on Russia. The tragedy happened again. In 1991, the West took the view, oh, the Cold War is over. We won. It's time for a peace dividend, and we have the end of history. I think when historians several centuries hence look, they're going to see the West's obsession with the idea of the end of history as one of the great failings of our time. And it's a failing that you and Ukraine are suffering more from than anyone else right now. But I do believe that the era of empires is over, and that doesn't mean it's over instantly. But I cannot imagine a world which will have a state centered on Moscow that will have borders anything like the ones today. And I believe that we will see, as that process unfolds, we will see both movements to extreme imperialism, extreme nationalism. I mean, Putin is unthinkable if you don't understand what 1991 meant to the KGB. For them, it was the loss of empire. For a lot of Russians, 1991 was something good. Putin has sold the West and many Russians on the idea that the 1990s were a terrible time. No, they weren't a terrible time. They were a time when people could read what they wanted, say what they wanted, and where a lot of people did a whole lot better off. It's only now, well, it's a terrible thing, and Putin stabilized this great statesman. Well, no, he's a thug. He's a Stalinist thug. And we're misreading the situation because right now, this dictator isn't targeting us. But if he is allowed to win in Ukraine, if he is allowed to get as far as he wants, which is at least Odessa, and probably Lviv. If he gets that far, he won't stop. He'll have been sent a signal that the West is a hollow man, and he will go further. He will attack NATO countries, and ultimately he will attack the United States. I hope he doesn't have that much more time and power.
Mr. Goble, sometimes I think that despite of the existence of many clever and good experience experts on the West, many mistakes were done. Because it is a big surprise for me how it could happen. You just start to speak about that, but nevertheless, how it could happen that all the time nobody see in Putin such a potential of aggression. How it was a big mistake. And next one.
I regret to say that the reason for that has deep roots. The first root is that the people who focus on this region always hope that something better will come, and they keep looking for the better too soon. Second, I don't think the West, even to this day, is ready to admit just how evil the Soviet Union was. I think to this day, there are a lot of people who talk about how Moscow expanded education, it built industry, it defeated Hitler, therefore it's all is good. No, it did those things, but it built the Gulag. It destroyed people's lives because they wanted to breathe free. The West doesn't really want to look at that. But I suppose the more immediate cause, those are sort of cosmic causes, but I think the immediate causes. Suppose you're an official in a Western government. It's really tough to achieve things unless you imagine you have somebody on the other side who'll work with you. And so you have a tendency to believe that the major powers are headed by people who want to settle things, who want cooperation, especially if the other side is headed by leaders who are clever enough to play you like a violin. This is what Putin does. He holds out. Well, if you'll only be cooperative on this, we can do all these other things. And guess what? There are hundreds, if not thousands, of officials who work on foreign policy in Washington and other countries who are just thrilled with the possibility that maybe they can do something positive. What they fail to see is that there are occasions, this is one of them, where because of the incomplete disintegration of the Muscovite Empire, we face a situation where we have someone who's prepared to go to war. And this is much more like Germany in the 1920s than it is like the Soviet Union even in the 1980s. Gorbachev really did want a deal because he realized things were coming apart, and he thought a deal would prevent that. He didn't realize that he didn't have the capacity or the guts to do the horrible things that it would take. There were people who were prepared to do terrible things. I mean, as every Ukrainian knows, everything changed for the fate of the Soviet Union because of the coup, because it showed that right behind Gorbachev, who talked nicely to people, there was a large class of cadre, including people like Putin, who were quite prepared to drown everyone else in blood for them to remain in power. But we now are once again at a time when somehow a Western leader picks up a telephone, talks to Putin, thinks, I can cut a deal. Well, you can't with someone like that. Someone like that has to be defeated. You couldn't cut a deal with Hitler, and you can't cut a deal with Putin. But that's not a lesson that a lot of people want to learn, because it requires sacrifice, discipline, and thinking long term. And none of those qualities are in large supply at present, unfortunately. I still, I would hope that what we have learned in the West by the Ukrainian, remarkable achievement of the Ukrainian people, especially since February of 22, that people really do want to be free and that they really will fight. I remember in February 22 when the Russian military rolled over the Ukrainian border, and many people, the pessimists thought Putin might be right and it would take 3 days to get to Kiev. The optimists thought it might take longer, but there was very little sense that the Ukrainian people would stop this vicious dictator and his invading armies. You've done that. We should learn from that. It's my favorite image of the world is a picture of a blade of grass breaking through concrete. The concrete always looks stronger, but the blade of grass always wins. Today, Ukrainians are the blade of grass. You're offering a lesson, which I hope all of us will learn. The oppressors look strong. They look like the only people who matter. But the people who want to be free are ultimately the ones who are going to win. It isn't going to be easy. It isn't going to be without defeats along the way. But I believe it's something that if the international community recognizes what we're up against, and who, thank God, we have as our allies, namely the Ukrainians, then we can make it progress toward a much happier future sooner rather than later.
Mr. Goble, let me ask you to think a little bit about possible scenarios in Russia's war against Ukraine, because there are different interesting situations. For example, if you look for the West, for the understanding from the West, this war, at the beginning of the war, during the first 2 years of this big invasion, in West, many experts say that if Russia will struggle or we will have a war in Ukraine, Russia became weaker, weaker, and weaker, and in the end, just stop in Ukraine, and everything will be done. Year after, in this year, or even in 2024, we saw and we hear from Western leaders that they say that Russia is prepare for big war with NATO countries. And does it mean that Russia became stronger and stronger? It's the same. It's the same. It's about mistakes or not mistakes. It's a wrong understanding of the situation or no. And sorry for that, but maybe we could just take into account this experience, this situation, and let me ask you to think a little bit about a possible scenario for Ukraine, for Europe, for world, for America.
Okay. Well, first off, the West has fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Russia is a giant with not just feet of clay, but clay right up to the shoulders. It is weaker. It is in less good shape today than it was in February 22. That's a reality. However, it has strengthened itself in two ways, neither of which it should get credit for. The first is the response of the West to what was done was inadequate and in some ways misdirected. There were a lot of things that the West could have done and didn't do. We could have lifted all the visas of Russians in the West. We could have frozen all Russian assets in the West, and we could have done it in February of 22. We've done little of that, and we've delayed it out so that the Russians have time to move things around. That's why I said saying you're going to do tough things in 50 days is one more piece of a retreat. The second is the Russians have discovered, precisely because Putin is not committed to Marxism-Leninism, but rather power and aggression by it themselves, that threatening people using disinformation is incredibly effective. If people stop believing anything, then they'll stop believing good analysis as well as bad analysis, and they'll treat them as equal. And they'll tend to treat what Putin says as having more authority and being more true than in fact is the case. Putin is a thug. Thugs benefit when people don't believe that anyone will stand up against them. that's the general background I would make. With respect to the future, I think the next 7 weeks are going to be brutal and ugly. I think that we are going to see vastly more killing by the Russian military. And I think that the Russian army is going to do everything it can, probably not to take Kiev, but to take Odessa. That if the Russian army takes Odessa, Ukraine loses its largest port, its largest link to the outside world. And Putin would probably deal with an American leadership, at least, if not a European leadership, that would be willing to accept, quote, the facts on the ground. I fear that. I fear that is the outcome of the next 7 or 8 weeks. Having said that, I think that tells the Ukrainian people that they should expand on what they have done so far, and that is to be prepared to engage in guerrilla war. I think the Ukrainians, they've done some, they could do a lot more. And I think that they will do more to go after the weak points of the Russian Federation inside the Russian Federation. Not only ethnic, non-Russian ethnics, but also regions. I hope that Zelyony Klin becomes a watchword for Ukrainians in the coming days. I think, though, that this is something that should be done. Will it defeat Moscow in this? No. Will it make it tougher on Moscow? You bet. They're terrified of the Ukrainians in the Far East. They're terrified of the Ukrainians along the Kazakh-Russian border. They're terrified of the Idel-Ural peoples of the Middle Volga. Ukrainian support for those things is all a good thing. Now, can that by itself necessarily reverse what I'm afraid I see in the next few weeks? No. What it can do, however, is lead more and more people in Russia to conclude that this is not a war we really want to fight. We're going to lose more than we're going to gain. And at some point, somebody is going to go into Putin's office and say, this is a game that can no longer go. That's my hope. When that will happen, I don't know. But the good news is that he can't live forever. And as being 76 myself, I think a lot about not living forever. But I think that's something that there are Russians who are not on that, who are not in his camp. And a lot of people have bought the idea that everybody is. No, that's not true. With respect to Europe and the United States, one is I think that the Europeans are getting better and better. I've been impressed as I could not have expected to be by the Germans and the French who've really stepped up. I'm not happy at all with my own government. I think that we're wrong. I think we defer far too much to Putin. I think we engage in too much Putin-like activities, in fact. Do I think that's forever? No, I don't. I think there are millions of good Americans who are not part of that. And so I think there may be changes again in the United States in a good direction. Again, is it going to come in the next month or two? No, not necessarily. Is it going to come over time? Yes. I I've always said I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. I think that in the short term, things may very well get a great deal worse. I think in the longer term, what Ukrainians have already won, they will build on, and they will be a model for others. And I think that's just great. I think it's something you can be incredibly proud of. Um, I I I hope that that happy future comes as soon as possible and with as little suffering as possible. But I also believe it will come. And when people recognize that, and it'll probably be late, unfortunately, in a lot of places, including my own country, we will have a much better world.
Um, Mr. Goble, thank you so much. But let me ask you the last question. I think
Okay.
it is very important because do you think that partnership among Russia, North Korea, China, Iran, Belarus matter? Or it just matter not just for Ukraine, but for the world as well? For
I
Europe?
think you've just listed the chief outcasts of the world. The Chinese, I think, are in a slightly, I think each of those countries in a slightly different position. I think I think the Chinese are very suspicious of the Russians. And I think that the China, which takes a much longer term view of the world than anyone else, is looking forward to a day when the Russians won't be east of the Urals. And I think that the Russians know that, and they're worried about that. So the Chinese role, short term, possible help, long term, probably the world's best ally in seeing the end of the Russian Empire, probably. With respect to the Iranians, um, I don't see, I personally believe the deeper Russia gets involved in cooperation with Iran, the more people in the West will see Russia for what it is, so that it ultimately weakens them. If your top allies are a North Korean dictator and an Iranian Ayatollah, you're hardly the kind of person we want to have dealings with and want to support. So my sense is those things are much less useful to Moscow than a lot of people believe. And with respect to Belarus, again, I don't think the West has played it very smart. I think we have made a mistake in thinking we could make deals with Lukashenko. I think Lukashenko has to be overthrown and replaced with one of the many people in Belarus who are on the side of democracy and freedom. So I guess what I'm saying is, like the brick that looks strong, the grass is breaking through all over the place. And I'm happy that I lived at a time when we saw so much of we saw the bricks break so many times. And I hope to live long enough to see some more of the bricks fall apart and the more grass grow.
Mr. Goble, thank you so much. Thank you for being with
You're
us today.
welcome.
Thank you.